They were here before the first Europeans landed on these shores. Records suggest they welcomed the newcomers, even helped the Pilgrims survive that first winter and gain a foothold in this new world. Yet they were thereafter consistently dehumanized, marginalized, and forced from their lands, if not warred against, and pushed to the brink of survival. The first Americans, ahead on Wide Angle. A conversation of 28 minutes about a relationship stretching across 5 centuries must make certain concessions, accept particular starting points. For today's conversation, as implied in my opening, I will accept as true and beyond question that colonial America, followed by the U.S. government thereafter, behaved grievously toward those who called this land home for centuries prior. So, rather than debate those historical points, we'll instead explore questions such as, how did Native Americans survive those assaults, and what lessons might their plight have to teach us all? Joining me from her office at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to tackle such questions is Professor Melinda Maynor-Lowery. Dr. Maynor-Lowery is an associate professor of history there, as well as the director of the Center for the Study of the American South. She is the author of 2 books, with the second, The Lumbee Indians, An American Struggle, out this fall, and the basis of our conversation today. Welcome to Wide Angle, Professor Maynor-Lowery.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. People in New England are likely very familiar with Native American nations that occupied this land before the Europeans first came in the 1600s. The Wampanoags, the Pawtucket, the Micmac. Some might even know that the state of Massachusetts, where I'm sitting today, is named after the people who lived in the greater Boston area, the Massachusetts. You hail, however, from a tribe with likely considerably less name recognition in these parts, yes? The Lumbee. Nevertheless, they are the largest group of Native Americans east of the Mississippi. So if you would, tell us a bit about the Lumbee.
So the Lumbee's historic homeland expands between the James River in Virginia, north of where we are today, to the Great Pee Dee River of South Carolina, over all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, to the coast, and then inward to almost the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Our ancestors stem from that hundreds of small tribes and nations that occupied that territory prior to the arrival of Europeans. Over time, and with colonialism as the driving force, our ancestors relocated to what is now the territory in southeastern North Carolina, right along the border of South Carolina, where Interstate 95 runs through, a county called Robeson County, which is the most ethnically diverse rural county in the United States and the home of our 55,000 Lumbee Indians. The tribe has been occupying that specific territory for over 300 years. And the process of our migration to that spot, the way we've nurtured community there, is the subject of this newest book that I've finished. The Lumbees are as unique as we are alike. We treasure our kinship and place connections to one another. Whenever a Lumbee wants to know who another Lumbee is, we ask each other 2 questions. One is, who's your people? Who's your family? And by that question, we can usually establish some relationship or connection to one another, some knowledge of one another. And then the second question is always, where do you stay? So for me, I was born in Robeson County, the kind of Lumbee homeland, but I was raised in Durham, North Carolina, about 2 hours away. So when I would tell people, and still do, that I was born down there and live in Durham, that helps them place me. That helps them understand why I might be their age, but they didn't go to high school with me, or why I'm the same age as their grandchild, but they don't know me. It's because I was raised elsewhere, and we have strong Lumbee communities in a variety of places outside southeastern North Carolina. We have a large Lumbee population in Baltimore, Maryland. We have a significant history in the Detroit area. We have Lumbees everywhere. So even though we are all kind of bonded by these attachments to family and to place, we've lived vastly different life experiences in all parts of the nation and the world, and we appreciate and value those uniquenesses about each other.
Right, right. And certainly, I know that you would argue that Native American nations, as you actually referenced, are very distinct, yes? And yet, you chose Lumbee history in particular as a vehicle, not only because you knew it, but as a means of exploring the relationship between U.S. history alongside Native American history. Yeah. So while the particulars of Lumbee history are specific to the Lumbee, there also exists some sort of overarching similarities between Native nations that we can sort of point to and talk about. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So at the risk of overgeneralizing, and I know that is a significant risk in this area, yeah? In what ways would it be understandable, if not anthropologically appropriate maybe, to liken the Lumbee of North Carolina with the Wampanoag perhaps of New England or the Navajo of the Southwest?
Well, those are great. That's a great question. I mean, I think there are certain common themes that indigenous people in the Americas share. Mm-hmm. And the arrival of Europeans and the phenomenon of African slavery is not the only one. I mean, that's certainly the time period in which those migrations to this continent occurred have profoundly affected all the indigenous people on this land. Mm-hmm. But as you alluded to in your introduction, we have far from disappeared. And so anywhere you sit on North America, you are on indigenous land in one way or another. And so when you talk about Lumbee history, you're also talking about Navajo history, or you're talking about Wampanoag history, to the extent that each of us have unique claims in our places and we maintain and hold on to those claims. Right. The way we do it can vary widely, but it's important, I think, for all Americans to understand and reckon with the fact that Native people are still very much here, and that they have a concrete and an undeniable relationship to these places, even as we've welcomed and sometimes argued with and sometimes opposed the settlers and their actions since their arrival. I think another theme that the Lumbees have in common with other American Indian nations is the phenomenon of adaptation. So many historians have talked about assimilation as a process that American Indians have gone through as we've survived or learned to accommodate the presence of Europeans and others on our land. Mm-hmm. But I think American Indians who identify that way and exist in our societies today really look at assimilation more as a process of adaptation. So all cultures change. And when we talk about Native American identity, sometimes we assume that you're a real Indian the more you evidence not changing. Yes, so if I look like Pocahontas or something like that, people are more likely to assume that I'm an American Indian, or to assume that I'm who I say I am. Right. But in fact, of course, I don't match a stereotype, and very few people do or should have to, right? But American Indians across the country are subject to those types of labels and categorizations in ways that other Americans are not. So our very organic culture change is not always recognized by mainstream society, but it's something that we've all gone through and we've all adapted to it. The remarkable things about being Native is just the ability to continue to adapt and maintain a strong sense of who we are.
Yeah, I mean and truly that was one area that I'm fascinated by, because certainly, as much as the United States of America is sort of characterized by the freedom to constantly reinvent itself, the nature of, at least in the popular culture, of a Native American is to remain static, yes, is to have ponytails and feathers, yes?
Mm-hmm. Beads, feathers, high cheekbones.
Yeah. You share, actually in the book itself, at the front, you share an exchange wherein you, as a 7-year-old, are trying to convince an elementary school classmate that you are indeed an Indian, and you just sort of offer that you were born in a teepee, and
Right.
you allow that you indeed were not born in a teepee, you were born in a hospital. But it speaks to both the sort of mainstream culture's assumptions about what constitutes Indianness, as well as a young Indian's idea of what that is too. Like how does that happen over time to remain true to what it is to be a Lumbee, but also to be a human that evolves and changes?
Right. So I think American Indians are not typically afforded that flexibility of culture change because of the process of colonialism. And colonialism has meant that in order for Europeans in particular to establish a legitimate claim on this land, they've essentially had to erase or fundamentally deny the legitimacy of the indigenous people who remained here, despite those efforts at extraction and genocide. So one of the consistent tactics has been to insist that Native people are only legitimate if they match a very narrow set of stereotypical characteristics. And that illustration I gave in the book was my kind of humorous reflection on how I just, without even thinking about it as a 7-year-old, embraced those same stereotypes because I thought it would convince this classmate of mine that my identity was legitimate and authentic. Those stereotypes are literally everywhere in our culture. My dad was a huge Gunsmoke fan, and he loved Westerns. And it was something that I remember my household as thinking the Indians in those television shows and movies were not us. But at the same time, when given the opportunity to identify to somebody else who I was, I just parroted the same stereotype. And so that's how kind of insidious, in a way, this particular strategy of colonialism has been. At the same time, it has some uniquenesses here in the South because this is a region where society has been very divided between two racial groups, and so the emphasis on that division between two racial groups doesn't often allow for the existence of a third or fourth or fifth kind of community. But knowing, that I belong to that community, at various points in my life, I've had to reach for metaphors or images that I thought the person I was talking to could easily understand. And so even when it would match a stereotype, or even when I knew I might be saying something that was twisted or not authentic, it was usually successful in helping that other person understand that, oh yeah, you are an Indian, for this reason that might have nothing to do with actually who you are, but has everything to do with what colonialism has taught us about who we should be.
So the colonialism, and certainly we look back probably to more obvious expressions of it, be they wars, be they forced relocations, be they the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian boarding schools, largely back in the 19th century. The colonialism is ongoing. It's more disguised today and perhaps more psychological than it is outward. Yeah?
Well, it's very much buried or ingrained within our mainstream culture, I would say. But then you also have some really obvious examples of colonialism when you think about the Standing Rock oil pipeline and the ways in which the company, the energy developer, colluded with the federal government to gain access to lands held sacred by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and in particular to aggressively endanger their water supply. That is a very obvious version of colonialism that other American communities are simply not subjected to. When you look at the Standing Rock issue, people can recall how the town of Bismarck was successful in insisting that the pipeline be routed away from Bismarck. But the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has not been successful in insisting that pipeline not interfere with their lands. Here in eastern North Carolina, we're working with a similar phenomenon with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. It's a natural gas pipeline. Not the same process or story as Standing Rock, but nevertheless an energy development project that's having a disproportionate impact on our state's indigenous people. And North Carolina has the largest population of American Indians east of the Mississippi. And so this pipeline running through rural counties, as it does, is having a disproportionate impact.
Yeah.
Very obvious example of the same logic of extractive colonialism that this nation was, in many respects, founded upon.
Right. Well, let's take a quick break there, Melinda, and invite viewers to join us on the other side, where we'll explore the possibility of learning from the mistakes of our forefathers.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. For information about this episode or to view other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle.
Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudez, speaking today with Professor Melinda Maynor Lowery about the Lumbee Indians, as well as this country's evolving understanding of and relationship with Native Americans. All right, Melinda, we finished the first half talking about colonialism's impact on the Lumbee, on Native Americans more generally. Colonialism notwithstanding, the Lumbee have had success, not only having their voices heard, but maintaining some level of authority over their communities, unlike some other Native American nations. So I guess my questions maybe are twofold as we start the second half. One would be, how have your people maintained that control? And the follow-up is, would those approaches conceivably be instructive to other groups, not only Native Americans, but also groups that are simply not part of the dominant culture?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that as a historian, I approach evidence of persistence in the past from with very specific causal relationships in mind. So I always seek to understand the intimate details of the context of an event to understand why that event occurred. And when I think about, I then of course try to expand that out into themes to understand what do these different events have in common. Right. What I see about the Lumbee case is and how we've maintained some degree of autonomy and power over our own affairs is somewhat applicable to other communities. And then there are some important differences. So some of the themes that Lumbees, some of the tactics that Lumbees have consistently employed to maintain that control include a kind of adaptation to the racial binary of the South. So over time, as that binary has evolved, it hasn't always been the case that we've had a biracial region, but as that biracial region evolved through the protection of slavery and then the tragedy of the Civil War, Lumbees sort of seized an opportunity through that binary to carve out a separate racially defined space for themselves. Prior to the Civil War, we began to be classified, for example, as mulattoes instead of as American Indians. And the logic behind that classification was that there weren't supposed to be any American Indians in the South any longer. They were removed on the Trail of Tears. So the ones that were still here really needed a different kind of label, a different kind of categorization. We also had an invisible relationship to the federal government. So the federal government, I think, did not know we were here up until the early 19th century. And during that critical time period between the Trail of Tears and the early 19th century, Lumbees took advantage of that kind of biracial society to say, we are going to reject our association with African Americans, and we're going to, in many respects, reject our association with whites, to embrace segregation. It's kind of an ironic phenomenon to think about a minority group actually embracing the idea of separating itself from larger society. But our ancestors saw an opportunity, I think, in the ways in which segregated schools and churches were being used to sustain the autonomy and privilege of white Southerners. And we saw that as a way to sustain our own autonomy and privilege, and also to continue our family and place attachments and to govern those attachments ourselves. So taking advantage of that racial binary and the way that it evolved in the 19th century and early 20th century, was a unique opportunity for us, but of course it also created some unique problems. And one of them was conceding the authority of whites to govern race relations. It meant that you, in many respects, had to abide by what white supremacists thought were appropriate race relations, which contradicted, of course, many of our own ancestors' actions when we would welcome in outsiders, white and black, from other communities. That was a very different strategy to survival than the one that we started to maintain following the Civil War. So that was one, effective but also compromised way of maintaining some degree of power and autonomy. Right. I think another really important tactic for Lumbees has been violence. So since before the American Revolution, outsiders have commented on our ability to exercise violence when it came to defending our territory and our property. Okay. And there are sort of many examples of this, a kind of defensive approach to violence when, for example, during the Civil War, the Confederacy was preying on young Lumbee men to draft them not into Confederate service, but to build fortifications and other infrastructure projects for the Confederacy that ultimately wound up killing these individuals because they were serving in areas that were infested with malaria or yellow fever or other contagious diseases. They were literally dying, not on the battlefield, but building a fort, for example. Right. And so the effort to resist Confederate conscription bloomed into a wide-scale resistance to white supremacy during and after the Civil War, where Lumbees were not afraid to use violence to protect our territory. Right.
Called the Lowry War.
That was called the Lowry War, right? Led by a young man named Henry Berry Lowry and his brothers-in-law, his cousins, as well as white and black members of the Lowry Gang. It was a multiracial alliance that carried this resistance to white supremacy forward. But through the Jim Crow years, that Lumbees placed less and less value on multiracial alliances because they were looking at the way white supremacy conducted itself and the particular limitations that it imposed on multiracial alliances. And so the other well-known episode of Lumbees deploying violence occurred in 1958 when we ambushed a Ku Klux Klan rally in our homeland, or adjacent to our homeland, near the town of Maxton, North Carolina. And the Klan had gathered there. They had burned 2 crosses on the yards of Lumbee families, which incensed the Lumbee community. I mean, that type of invasion of our community was just not acceptable. Of course, it was not acceptable to black Americans either, but law enforcement, ironically, came to a certain kind of defense of Lumbee people in the 1950s. North Carolina politicians and law enforcement officials in Robeson County realized that the Klan was not only putting themselves at danger, but was putting the entire white community at danger by affronting the Lumbees in this fashion. And so encouraged the Klan Grand Dragon, a man named Catfish Cole, to not hold this rally because Lumbees had threatened to kill him if he spoke at the rally. But he held the rally anyway, and a very small number of Klan members showed up because Lumbees had a widespread reputation for being willing to use violence when necessary. So the small group of Klan members that were there were essentially ambushed by 500 Lumbee men and some women who were armed and were intent upon making sure that Catfish Cole did not have a platform that night. And in fact, they were successful without any severe injuries. No one was killed. The only people arrested were a drunken Klan member and one other gentleman who also belonged to the Klan. And afterwards, even European American politicians came out in support of Lumbee's actions. So sometimes our uses of violence have been rewarded in interesting ways because some of our local dynamics have approved of them, or they've felt that they kind of protected the interests of society as a whole. When African Americans, on the other hand, would strike out violently against the Klan during the same period, they were typically punished brutally and retaliated against immensely. And Lumbees did not experience that type of retaliation, at least not as it related to this particular incident in 1958.
Yeah.
So, the ways in which other marginalized groups can kind of seize on our examples or the way that we do things is complicated.
Sure.
There's a logic to really not. I think maybe the important out or takeaway from some of these lessons of Lumbee history is that it doesn't always fall on the marginalized group to create the effective strategy. In many respects, it is the responsibility of white Americans, of people who are members of the dominant or mainstream society, to say how are we responsible for this conflict, and what do we need to do to remedy it? And the 1958 Klan ambush is a good example of, for whatever their own motivations were, they weren't pure or necessarily altruistic, but white law enforcement said, we're going to take the right side of history here, and we're not going to protect the Klan as they go after the Lumbees. We're going to encourage the Klan to stand down, and we're going to not retaliate against any Lumbees who participate in this incident. Yeah. And so that's an example of when I think members of the mainstream society can actually step forward and do the right thing, stand on the right side of history, instead of waiting for people who have been marginalized for these hundreds of years to come up with the clever strategy that would work. There's that kind of takeaway from our too.
Right. You've been watching the first installment of my two-part conversation with Professor Melinda Maynor Lowery about the Lumbee Indians of North Carolina. I invite you to join us for episode 2, where we'll broaden our focus to think about Native Americans more generally, explore the ways in which our past finds expression through the present, and imagine a path into our children's future guided by one of this country's founding principles, equality. On behalf of Melinda Maynor Lowery, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.